The fluorescent lights in the Pentagon briefing room cast harsh shadows across Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's face as she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap while three-star generals debated her fate. The room smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic authority, the kind of sterile atmosphere where careers were made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. Outside the reinforced windows, Washington, D.C. hummed with the controlled chaos of a government that never slept. But inside this particular room, time seemed suspended as men in pressed uniforms discussed whether she was worth the trouble. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The psychological evaluation is concerning, General Harrison was saying, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd never questioned an order in 30 years of service. He held a manila folder thick with assessments, medical records, and performance reviews that reduced Sarah's entire military career to a collection of checkboxes and recommendations. Dr. Reeves notes excessive empathy, reluctance to engage in aggressive tactics, and what he describes as an inability to compartmentalize emotional responses during high-stress scenarios. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though something cold settled in her stomach. She'd known this moment was coming ever since the incident in Syria, when she'd hesitated for 3 crucial seconds before taking a shot that could have ended a hostage situation. 3 seconds that had given the target time to escape. 3 seconds that had resulted in a successful rescue but a failed mission objective. 3 seconds that had apparently convinced her superiors that Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was too soft for the kind of work the 75th Ranger Regiment demanded. The second general, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter storms, leaned forward slightly. General Patricia Webb had a reputation for being harder than most of the men in her position. Someone who'd clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated hierarchy by being twice as ruthless and 3 times as competent as anyone around her. Her tactical scores are exemplary, Webb said, consulting her own set of documents. Top 5% in marksmanship, navigation, and survival training. Her team consistently rates her leadership abilities as exceptional. But does she have the killer instinct? Harrison countered, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. Special operations isn't about being the best soldier in perfect conditions. It's about making the hard choices when everything goes wrong. It's about pulling the trigger when hesitation means your team doesn't come home. Sarah had heard variations of this conversation before, usually behind closed doors where people thought she couldn't hear them. The whispered concerns about weather. Someone who volunteered at homeless shelters in her spare time could really handle the moral ambiguity of Black Ops missions. The questions about whether a woman who sent care packages to the families of fallen enemies was psychologically equipped for the kind of work that required you to sleep soundly after taking lives. The truth was more complicated than the psychological profiles suggested. Sarah had killed before, had taken lives when the mission demanded it, had made peace with the reality that sometimes violence was the only language that prevented greater violence. But she'd never learned to enjoy it, never developed the emotional calluses that seemed to come naturally to some of her peers. Every life she took stayed with her, not as guilt exactly, but as a reminder of the weight that came with the power to end someone's story. There's also the matter of her family background. The 3rd general spoke up for the first time. General Marcus Kane was younger than the others, someone who'd risen through the ranks during the recent conflicts in the Middle East. His file said he'd earned his stars through innovative tactics and an understanding that modern warfare required a different kind of thinking. Her father was a conscientious objector during Vietnam and became a social worker after college. Her mother runs a nonprofit that provides support services to refugee families. Sarah almost smiled at that. Her parents had been horrified when she'd announced her intention to join the military, had spent years trying to understand how their daughter, who'd organized food drives in high school, had ended up in Army fatigues. But they'd supported her. Anyway, the way good parents do when their children choose paths they can't comprehend, but can't deny. The psychological profile suggests that her family values create internal conflict regarding mission objectives that require aggressive action. Kane continued, reading from what looked like a psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Reeves recommends reassignment to a support role where her skills can be utilized without compromising operational effectiveness. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, though she'd been expecting them. Support role. A polite way of saying she wasn't cut out for the real work, wasn't hard enough for the missions that mattered. She thought about the last 2 years of her life, the training exercises that had pushed her past every limit she thought she had, the sleepless nights studying tactical manuals and survival guides, the weekends spent on shooting ranges until her hands cramped and her shoulder ached from rifle recoil. General Webb was studying Sarah directly now, her gaze intense and evaluating. "Lieutenant Mitchell, you've been silent through this entire discussion. Do you have anything to say about these assessments?" Sarah met the general's eyes without flinching. This was the moment she'd been preparing for without knowing it. The test that wasn't written in any manual or covered in any training exercise. "Ma'am, with respect, I believe the assessments are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes an effective special operations soldier." Harrison's eyebrows shot up at the directness of her response. In his experience, junior officers didn't challenge psychological evaluations, especially not when their careers hung in the balance. "Explain," he said curtly. "The assumption seems to be that caring about collateral damage, about civilian casualties, about the human cost of our operations makes someone weak or unreliable," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "But in my experience, sir, the soldiers who care the most are often the ones who fight the hardest to bring everyone home. They're the ones who find creative solutions because they can't accept that good people have to die for the mission to succeed." She paused, aware that she was walking a tightrope between defending herself and insubordination. "The hesitation in Syria wasn't because I couldn't pull the trigger. It was because I saw a solution that could achieve the mission objective without additional casualties. I was right." "You were lucky," Harrison corrected. "And in special operations, we can't afford to rely on luck." "It wasn't luck, sir. It was training and instinct and the ability to process multiple variables under pressure." The hostage was positioned in a way that suggested the target was using him as a human shield rather than intending to execute him. The target's body language indicated increasing panic rather than violent intent. "Taking the shot when I did would have resulted in civilian casualties that weren't necessary for mission success." Webb leaned back in her chair, something that might have been approval flickering across her features. "You made a tactical decision based on real-time assessment of the situation." "Yes, ma'am. The same way I've been trained to do in every exercise, every simulation, every scenario we've run. The only difference was that this time, there were real consequences for getting it wrong." Kane was taking notes now, his expression thoughtful. "The mission report indicates that your alternative approach resulted in the successful extraction of all hostages and the capture of 2 high-value targets instead of 1. "That's correct, sir. And you accomplished this by ... Kane consulted his files. ... Convincing the secondary target to surrender voluntarily." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, knowing how this part of the story sounded to men who'd been trained to solve problems with overwhelming force. "I spoke to him in his native language, acknowledged that he was trying to protect his family, and offered him a deal that would ensure their safety in exchange for his cooperation." Harrison made a sound that might have been disgust or disbelief. "You negotiated with a terrorist." "I used available intelligence to achieve a better outcome than the original mission parameters called for," Sarah replied evenly. "The target had intelligence about 3 separate cells operating in the region. That information saved American lives." The room fell silent for a moment. The only sound the hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant murmur of traffic outside. Sarah could feel her heart beating against her ribs, but she kept her breathing steady and her expression calm. This was either the end of her special operations career or the beginning of something else entirely. Webb broke the silence first. "Lieutenant Mitchell, you're aware that your approach in Syria was unconventional?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're also aware that unconventional approaches carry risks that extend beyond the immediate mission?" "Yes, ma'am." "But you're not apologetic about your choices?" Sarah considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would determine everything that came next. "Ma'am, I'm sorry that my methods raised concerns about my fitness for duty. But I'm not sorry that I found a way to save lives while still accomplishing the mission. I can't apologize for being the kind of soldier who looks for alternatives to violence when those alternatives exist." General Kane closed his file and looked at his colleagues. "Gentlemen, ma'am, I think we need to reconsider our definition of what makes an effective special operations soldier." Harrison's expression suggested he thought Kane had lost his mind. "Marcus, you can't seriously be considering ... I'm considering the fact that Lieutenant Mitchell achieved better results than our original mission parameters through innovative thinking and cultural awareness." Kane interrupted. "I'm considering the fact that her psychological profile, while unconventional, might actually be an asset in the kind of complex operations we're facing in the current theater." Webb was nodding slowly. "The world has changed since we developed our standard special operations protocols. We're not just fighting conventional armies anymore. We're operating in environments where cultural sensitivity and community engagement are as important as tactical superiority." "She's too soft," Harrison insisted, his voice carrying the finality of someone who'd made up his mind. "When the situation requires decisive action, when there's no time for negotiation or cultural sensitivity, when it comes down to killing or being killed, she hesitates. And that hesitation will get people killed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah felt something harden inside her chest, a crystalline clarity that cut through the uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued her since Syria. "Sir, with respect, you're wrong." The words came out harder than she'd intended, carrying an edge that surprised even her. Harrison's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Sarah pressed on. "You're wrong because you're assuming that caring about the consequences of violence makes someone incapable of violence when it's necessary. You're wrong because you think empathy is a weakness instead of intelligence. And you're wrong because you've confused ruthlessness with effectiveness." The room went dead silent. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 3 sets of eyes evaluating every word she'd just spoken. She'd either ended her career with that outburst or finally shown them who she really was underneath the psychological profiles. And performance reviews. Webb's voice, when it came, was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Lieutenant Mitchell, you're dismissed. We'll have a decision for you within 48 hours. Sarah stood, saluted with crisp precision, and walked out of the briefing room with her spine straight and her head high. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of voices as the 3 generals began what she knew would be a heated discussion about her future. In the hallway outside, the Pentagon continued its relentless operation, staffers hurrying past with classified documents and urgent expressions, the machinery of American military power grinding on, regardless of the personal dramas playing out in individual briefing rooms. Sarah found herself in a bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink, trying to process what had just happened. The woman looking back at her wore the uniform of a United States Army officer, bore the insignia of someone who'd earned the right to serve in elite units, carried herself with the confidence that came from years of training and discipline. But behind her eyes was something that psychological evaluations couldn't measure, and performance reviews couldn't quantify. a determination that ran deeper than career ambitions or institutional approval. Sarah splashed cold water on her face and made a decision that would change everything that came after. Whatever the generals decided, whatever recommendations went into her permanent file, whatever assignments she received or didn't receive, she was going to prove that her way of being a soldier was not just valid, but necessary. She had no idea that within 6 months, she would be given the chance to prove it in ways that no training exercise or psychological evaluation could prepare her for. She had no idea that her supposedly soft heart and dangerous empathy would become the exact qualities that kept her alive when everything else failed. For now, she simply walked out of the Pentagon and into the humid Washington afternoon, carrying with her the unshakable conviction that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to become something you're not. Even when everyone around you insists that's what strength looks like. 6 weeks after the Pentagon briefing that had nearly ended her career, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell found herself in the most unlikely place possible, sitting across from Colonel James Kellerman in a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia. The walls were beige, the furniture was government-issued standard, and nothing about the room suggested that the man behind the desk ran some of the most classified operations in the United States. Military. Kellerman was not what Sarah had expected. When the mysterious summons had arrived through encrypted channels, instead of the grizzled Special Forces stereotype, he looked more like a college professor who happened to wear military insignia. Wire-rimmed glasses, graying hair that suggested he was more comfortable behind a desk than in the field, and an easy smile that made Sarah immediately suspicious. In her experience, the most dangerous people in the military were often the ones who looked the least threatening. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he began, consulting a file that was significantly thicker than any she'd seen before. "I've been following your case with considerable interest. Your performance evaluations make for fascinating reading." Sarah remained silent, having learned the hard way that volunteering information rarely worked in her favor. The past 6 weeks had been a study in bureaucratic limbo, not quite dismissed from special operations, but not assigned to any meaningful duties either. She'd spent her days in administrative roles that felt designed to encourage her resignation, filing reports and updating databases while watching her peers deploy on missions she'd trained years to be part of. Your psychological profile describes you as emotionally compromised, tactically unsound, and unsuitable for high-risk operations, Kellerman continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Dr. Reeves recommends reassignment to supply chain management or military intelligence analysis. Safe desk jobs where your apparent inability to make hard decisions won't endanger American lives. The words stung, partly because Sarah had read the same recommendations herself, and partly because some dark corner of her mind wondered if they might be right. Maybe she was fooling herself about her capabilities. Maybe the generals who'd questioned her fitness were seeing something she couldn't acknowledge about herself. Kellerman set down the file and looked at her directly, his expression shifting from casual to intensely focused. "What Dr. Reeves and the review board failed to understand is that you weren't showing weakness in Syria. You were demonstrating a different kind of strength, the kind we desperately need for a mission that conventional special operations can't handle." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression neutral. "Sir, 3 months ago, a joint CIA military intelligence operation in Eastern Europe went sideways. Bad intelligence, compromised assets, the usual cascade of failures that happen when we try to operate in environments we don't understand." Kellerman pulled out a series of satellite photographs, spreading them across the desk like a poker player revealing his hand. The images showed dense forest, mountainous terrain, and what looked like small villages scattered throughout valleys that seemed carved from another century. The Carpathian Mountains, along the border between Romania and Ukraine. Officially, it's a region of minor strategic importance. Unofficially, it's become a corridor for human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and intelligence operations from several hostile nations. Sarah studied the photographs, noting the isolation of the terrain, the limited road access, the kind of geography that could swallow entire military units without leaving a trace. What kind of operation went wrong? The kind where good people trusted the wrong intelligence and walked into an ambush that was 3 weeks in the planning. Kellerman's casual demeanor disappeared entirely, replaced by something harder and more urgent. Captain Rebecca Chun and Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, both from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. They were conducting reconnaissance on what we believed was a weapons cache. Instead, they found themselves guests of a trafficking organization that has connections to organized crime syndicates across 3 countries. The weight of what Kellerman was telling her settled in Sarah's stomach like a stone. 2 Delta Force operators captured by criminals who had every reason to make them disappear permanently. How long have they been missing? 72 hours as of this morning. Every hour that passes makes their recovery less likely and their survival questionable. Kellerman leaned forward, his intensity filling the small room. Here's what makes this situation particularly challenging. The trafficking organization is embedded within local communities that have been terrorized into cooperation. Traditional rescue operations would require significant military force, which would result in civilian casualties and international incidents we can't afford. Sarah was beginning to understand why she was sitting in this room, why someone had pulled her from administrative purgatory for a conversation about a mission that sounded impossible. You need someone who can operate without causing collateral damage. I need someone who can think like the people we're trying to save instead of thinking like the enemy we're trying to defeat, Kellerman corrected. Someone who understands that sometimes the mission isn't about overpowering the opposition, but about finding solutions they don't expect. The colonel pulled out another set of documents, these ones bearing the kind of classification markings that meant careers ended for people who saw them without authorization. The trafficking network is run by a man named Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz who went private after the Soviet collapse. He's built an organization that controls territory through a combination of violence and economic dependency. The local population isn't loyal to him by choice, they're trapped by circumstances. Sarah examined the intelligence reports, noting the careful analysis of social structures, economic pressures, and community dynamics. This wasn't the kind of tactical briefing she was used to receiving. You want to turn the population against him. I want to give them the opportunity to save themselves while we save our people, Kellerman said. But that requires someone who can gain their trust, understand their fears, and find ways to help them that don't involve calling in airstrikes. The mission was starting to take shape in Sarah's mind, and what she saw both thrilled and terrified. Sir, this sounds like the kind of operation that could take weeks or months to develop properly. These communities don't trust outsiders, especially American military personnel. Building the kind of relationships you're describing requires time and cultural understanding that most special operations teams don't possess. Most special operations teams, Kellerman agreed, which is why most special operations teams aren't suited for this mission. But you're not in most special operations teams, are you, Lieutenant? The question hung between them, weighted with implications that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Sir, my language skills are limited to basic conversational Russian and Romanian. My cultural training focused on Middle Eastern populations, not Eastern European communities. I've never operated in this kind of terrain or climate. But you have operated in environments where the local population was initially hostile, where winning hearts and minds was as important as tactical superiority, where understanding cultural dynamics made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, Kellerman countered. Your service record in Afghanistan shows a pattern of building trust with community leaders. gathering intelligence through relationship building rather than interrogation, achieving objectives through cooperation rather than coercion. Sarah remembered those deployments, the months spent learning local customs and building relationships with village elders, who had every reason to distrust American soldiers. The work had been slow, often frustrating, frequently dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with enemy fire. But it had been effective in ways that conventional operations couldn't match. The psychological profile that labels you as too soft describes someone who sees civilians as human beings rather than obstacles or assets, Kellerman continued. Someone who understands that sustainable security requires community buy-in, not just military dominance. Those aren't weaknesses, Lieutenant. For this mission, they're essential qualifications. The colonel stood and walked to a map mounted on the wall, pointing to a region highlighted in red. Chun and Torres are being held somewhere in this valley system. Kozlov's operation is distributed across multiple villages, with the local population providing labor, logistics, and security through a combination of coercion and economic dependency. A conventional rescue attempt would require significant military assets, would likely result in substantial civilian casualties, and would definitely alert every intelligence service in the region to our activities in the area. Sarah joined him at the map, studying the terrain and trying to visualize the kind of operation he was describing. What you're proposing sounds more like a humanitarian mission than a military operation. What I'm proposing is a recognition that the two aren't mutually exclusive, Kellerman said. The trafficking network survives because it exploits vulnerable populations. If we can address the vulnerabilities, we can undermine the network. If we can undermine the network, we can create opportunities to recover our personnel. The scope of what he was suggesting began to sink in. This wasn't a raid or a rescue mission in any conventional sense. It was something closer to community organizing with a military objective. The kind of long-term engagement that required patience, cultural sensitivity, and exactly the kinds of skills that had gotten her labeled as unsuitable for special operations. Sir, even if I could gain the trust of the local population, even if I could identify opportunities to disrupt Kozlov's operation, I would still need support assets, extraction capabilities, and backup planning for when things inevitably go wrong, Sarah said, thinking through the practical challenges of operating alone in hostile territory. This sounds like a mission that requires a team, not an individual operator. Kellerman's smile returned, but it wasn't entirely reassuring. That's where things get complicated, Lieutenant. This operation is classified at levels that limit the number of people who can be briefed on its existence. Official support would require congressional notification, interagency coordination, and the kind of bureaucratic approval process that takes months we don't have. The implications of what he was saying crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. You're asking me to operate without official backup. I'm asking you to operate with the kind of flexibility that official channels can't provide, Kellerman corrected. You would have communications equipment, extraction protocols, and emergency support options. But the day-to-day decisions, the tactical choices, the relationship building that makes the mission possible, that would be your responsibility. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with impossible challenges, mixed with a cold understanding of exactly how dangerous this mission would be. Operating alone in hostile territory, without immediate backup, trying to build trust with communities that had every reason to be suspicious of American soldiers, all while searching for captured operators who might already be dead. Why me? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Because every other operator we've considered approaches this mission as a military problem with a military solution, Kellerman said. Because you're the only person I've found who might see it as a human problem that requires human solutions. Because your psychological profile, the one that convinced 3 generals that you're unfit for special operations, Describes exactly the kind of person who might be able to pull off something this unconventional. Sarah looked at the map again, at the villages scattered throughout mountain valleys, where 2 American soldiers were being held by criminals, where local populations were trapped between poverty and violence, where the kind of conventional military, thinking she'd been trained to apply, would only make the situation worse. Sir, if I accept this mission and it goes wrong, if I'm captured or killed, or simply disappear into those mountains, what happens to Chun and Torres? If you don't accept this mission, Kellerman replied quietly, they're already dead. We just haven't admitted it yet. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled sounds of Langley's everyday operations continuing beyond the walls. Sarah understood that she was being offered exactly what she'd wanted, the chance to prove that her approach to special operations wasn't a weakness but a different kind of strength. She was also being offered the chance to fail spectacularly and validate every criticism that had been made about her suitability for this kind of work. When do I leave? She asked, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. The insertion went wrong from the first minute. Sarah crouched in the dense undergrowth of a Romanian forest, her breath forming small clouds in the October air as she listened to the distant sound of helicopters that weren't supposed to be there. The drop zone was supposed to be clear, a remote valley where she could begin her approach to the target villages without alerting Kozlov's network. Instead, she found herself watching military aircraft sweep the area in patterns that suggested they knew exactly where an American operative had been inserted. The communications equipment crackled softly in her ear, Colonel Kellerman's voice, distorted by encryption and distance. Archer 7, what's your status? Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows between 2 massive pine trees, their bark rough against her back as she watched the search pattern continue overhead. Compromised. Insertion. Multiple aircraft conducting search operations in the target area. Recommend abortion and extraction. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to count her heartbeats, each one echoing the growing certainty that this mission was already spiraling beyond her control. When Kellerman's voice returned, it carried the weight of decisions being made at levels far above her pay grade. Negative on extraction. Intelligence indicates Chun and Torres were moved to a secondary location after the aircraft activity began. If we abort now, we lose their trail completely. Sarah closed her eyes and processed what that meant. The mission had been compromised before she'd even reached the ground, which suggested either catastrophic security failures or deliberate betrayal somewhere in the chain of command. Either way, she was now operating in an environment where every assumption about friendly support and secure communications was questionable. Understood. Proceeding to alternative approach routes. What Sarah didn't mention was that the alternative routes would add 3 days to her timeline, would require her to traverse terrain that was both more dangerous and more likely to expose her to local populations before she was ready to make contact. The careful mission planning that had consumed weeks of preparation was now useless, replaced by the kind of improvisation that separated living operators from dead ones. She moved through the forest with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that speed was less important than avoiding detection. The Carpathian Mountains were deceptively treacherous dense forest that could hide an army, but also steep valleys where a single misstep could result in injury that would end the mission before it began. The October weather was unpredictable, swinging between unseasonably warm afternoons and nights that dropped below freezing without warning. By the second day, Sarah had covered less than half the distance she'd planned, forced to take extensive detours around villages where the helicopter activity had clearly increased local security awareness. She'd observed patrols of men with military-grade weapons moving through areas that were supposed to be controlled by civilian populations, confirming that Kozlov's influence was more extensive than the intelligence briefings had indicated. First real setback came on the 3rd day, When she attempted to gather intelligence from a shepherd she'd observed watching his flock in an isolated meadow. The man appeared to be alone, elderly, probably harmless, exactly the kind of peripheral contact that could provide crucial information about local conditions without exposing her. Mission. Sarah approached slowly, using basic Romanian phrases. She'd rehearsed during mission preparation. Bună ziua. Scuzați-mă. The shepherd looked up from his work with the kind of wariness that came from living in a region where strangers meant trouble. He was older than she'd estimated, probably in his 70s, with hands weathered by decades of outdoor work and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. American, he said in accented English, the single word carrying enough suspicion to make Sarah's hand drift toward her concealed sidearm. I'm a journalist, she replied in Romanian, using the cover story that had seemed plausible during mission planning. I'm researching traditional farming methods in the region. The shepherd's laugh was harsh and entirely without humor. Journalist with military boots and satellite radio equipment. Very traditional farming research. Sarah's cover was blown. But running would only confirm his suspicions and potentially alert the entire network to her presence. Instead, she made a decision that went against every protocol she'd been taught about covert operations. You're right, she said, switching to English. I'm an American soldier. But I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm looking for 2 of my soldiers, who were taken by men with guns. I think they're being held somewhere in this region. The shepherd studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting through calculation, suspicion, and something that might have been pity. You don't understand where you are. You don't understand what you're walking into. Then help me understand. The men with guns, they don't just take soldiers. They take daughters, sons, anyone who opposes them or fails to cooperate. They promise work, money, better life. Instead, they create slaves. The shepherd's voice carried the weight of personal loss. My granddaughter taken 3 months ago, 16 years old. They said she would work in a restaurant in Bucharest. We know better now. Sarah felt the familiar anger that came from encountering the human cost of the network she'd been trained to combat. But she also recognized an opportunity to build the kind of trust that might make her mission possible. I'm sorry for your loss, she said quietly. The men I'm looking for, they were trying to gather information to stop the people who took your granddaughter. If I can find them, if I can get them out, maybe we can work together to help your community. The shepherd's expression hardened. Work together? You Americans, you come here with your helicopters and your weapons and your promises. You make everything worse, then you leave. The men with guns, they stay. They remember who helped the Americans. The accusation stung because Sarah could see the logic behind it. Military interventions that prioritize short-term objectives over long-term consequences. Operations that exposed local populations to retaliation without providing lasting protection. The pattern of American forces arriving with good intentions and leaving behind situations that were worse than before. What if I told you I wasn't planning to leave? Sarah asked, making another decision that violated operational security but might salvage the mission. What if I stayed until we found a way to help your community protect itself? I would say you're either lying or crazy, the shepherd replied. One American woman against an organization that controls territory across 3 countries? This is not a movie. This is real life where good intentions get people killed. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the mountain air. The shepherd's demeanor changed instantly, shifting from suspicious conversation to urgent warning. Go. Now, they patrol this area every afternoon. If they find you here, they will ask questions I cannot answer safely. Sarah grabbed her pack and moved toward the tree line, but the shepherd called after her with words that would haunt the rest of her mission. Your soldiers, if they are still alive, they are not in this valley. Kozlov moves his valuable prisoners every few days. You are looking in the wrong place for people who may not exist anymore. The next 4 days were a study in operational frustration. Every attempt to make contact with local populations resulted in similar encounters. People who recognized her as American military, despite her civilian clothing, who understood that helping her would expose them to retaliation, who had already learned to survive by avoiding exactly the kind of involvement she needed. The intelligence picture grew more complex and more discouraging with each contact. Kozlov's network wasn't just a criminal organization operating in the region. It was a shadow government that controlled economic opportunities, provided security against competing criminal groups, and maintained order through a combination of violence and dependency that made conventional resistance virtually impossible. Sarah found herself in the position of trying to build trust with communities that had every rational reason to reject her help. Her presence endangered them. Her mission objectives required them to take risks that could result in their families being targeted. Her promise of American support rang hollow in the context of a region where American interventions had a history of creating more problems than they solved. The breaking point came on the 7th day, when she attempted to approach a village that intelligence suggested might be a logistics hub for the trafficking network. Sarah had planned to pose as a hiker who had become lost, hoping to gather information about the local population's relationship with Kozlov's organization. Instead, she found herself face to face with 3 armed men who clearly weren't local villagers. They wore tactical gear that suggested professional training, carried weapons that were newer and more sophisticated than anything civilian criminals typically possessed, and moved with the kind of coordination that indicated military or paramilitary background. "American soldier," the leader said in English, his accent suggesting Eastern European origin but extensive international experience. "You are very far from home." Sarah's hand was already moving toward her concealed weapon when she realized the futility of the situation. 3 against 1 in open terrain, with her only advantages being surprise and training that they clearly shared. Fighting would most likely result in her death and definitely compromise any chance of locating Chun and Torres. "I'm a journalist," she said, using the cover story one more time despite knowing it was unconvincing. "Journalist with ceramic body armor and encrypted communication equipment." The man replied, his smile suggesting he was enjoying the conversation. "We have been watching you for 3 days. Very interesting research methods." The admission that they'd been tracking her movements was almost as disturbing as the immediate threat. If Kozlov's people had been monitoring her since the failed village approach, then her operational security was completely compromised and every contact she'd made was potentially exposed. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, abandoning any pretense of maintaining her cover. "We want you to understand your situation," the leader replied. "You are one person, alone, in territory we control. The people you are trying to help cannot help you because helping you means death for their families. The soldiers you are looking for are not where you think they are. Your mission is impossible." Sarah felt the weight of 7 days of failed contacts, blown covers, and mounting evidence that the operation was fundamentally flawed. But she also felt the stubborn determination that had carried her through every challenge of her military career. "Then why haven't you killed me?" The question seemed to amuse the man. "Because we are professionals, not savages. Because you pose no real threat to our operations. And because we have a message for your superiors." He reached into his jacket and produced a small device that Sarah recognized as a high-end communications unit. "Tell them that American interference in local affairs creates instability that serves no one's interests. Tell them that the soldiers they are looking for are beyond recovery. Tell them that continuing this operation will result in consequences they are not prepared to accept." The device was clearly a gesture and opportunity to contact her handlers and relay the message. but also a demonstration that Kozlov's organization had capabilities and connections that extended far beyond local criminal activity. They weren't just trafficking networks. They were sophisticated operations with intelligence, capabilities, and political connections. Sarah took the device but didn't activate it immediately. And if I refuse to deliver your message, then you continue your impossible mission until the mountains kill you, or we decide you have become too much of a nuisance, the man replied with casual certainty. Either way, your soldiers remain lost and your operation fails. The three men disappeared into the forest as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Sarah alone with the communications device and the growing realization that everything she'd been told about this mission was either incomplete or deliberately misleading. The operation wasn't just difficult, it was designed to fail, and she was beginning to suspect that her failure might be exactly what someone wanted. The encrypted message that changed everything came through at 0347 hours on Sarah's 10th day. In the mountains, she was sheltering in an abandoned hunting cabin, her body finally warm after spending the previous night exposed to an unexpected snowstorm that had dropped temperatures below what her gear could handle. The cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it had blocked the wind and provided enough insulation for her to get her core temperature back to safe levels. The communication device crackled to life with Colonel Kellerman's voice. But something in his tone was different. Urgent in a way that suggested the parameters of her mission had shifted dramatically. Archer 7. Priority flash traffic. New intelligence indicates your targets are not in the primary search area. Repeat, Chun and Torres are not in the Carpathian region. Sarah sat up sharply, her mind racing through the implications. 10 days of increasingly difficult operations, blown covers, and mounting evidence that her mission was impossible. And now she was being told that the basic premise had been wrong from the beginning. Where are they? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would complicate rather than simplify her situation. Electronic intercepts suggest they were moved to a facility approximately 40 kilometers north of your current position. Terrain analysis indicates the location is a former Soviet military installation, HEAVILY fortified, probably serving as a central processing facility for Kozlov's operation. Sarah pulled out her topographical maps and located the area Kellerman was describing. What she saw made her stomach drop. The facility was positioned in terrain that was virtually inaccessible except through a single mountain pass, surrounded by steep valleys that would funnel any approach through predetermined kill zones, isolated enough that conventional rescue operations would require massive resources and result in significant casualties. Sir, that location is not accessible through covert insertion. Any attempt to reach that facility would require either a full-scale assault or... Sarah paused as a different possibility began to take shape in her mind. Or what, Lieutenant? Or someone who was already inside the network. Someone Kozlov's people trusted enough to grant access to their most secure facility. The silence that followed was long enough for Sarah to understand that she'd just articulated something Kellerman had been hoping she would figure out herself. Lieutenant, your mission parameters are being modified. Intelligence indicates that Kozlov's organization is planning to move Chun and Torres again within the next 72 hours. If they disappear from the current facility, we lose them permanently. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of a mission shifting beneath her feet. The way operations evolved when initial assumptions proved inadequate and new intelligence demanded different approaches. But this felt more dramatic than the usual tactical adjustments. What kind of modification are we talking about, sir? The kind that requires you to stop trying to work around Kozlov's network and start working within it. The implications of what Kellerman was suggesting crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. He wasn't just asking her to gather intelligence or build relationships with local communities anymore. He was asking her to infiltrate a sophisticated criminal organization, gain access to their most secure facility, and conduct a rescue operation from inside their own infrastructure. Sir, that's not a modification. That's a completely different mission requiring completely different capabilities and resources. It's the mission that the situation demands, Kellerman replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd already made the decision. Your conventional approach isn't working because this isn't a conventional situation. Kozlov's network is too sophisticated, too well integrated with local populations, too heavily defended for traditional special operations. Sarah looked around the abandoned cabin, taking inventory of her resources and comparing them to what such a mission would require. Her equipment was designed for reconnaissance and survival, not for deep infiltration of criminal organizations. Her cover story was already blown with multiple local contacts. Her understanding of the organization's internal structure was based on intelligence that had already proven unreliable. How exactly do you propose I gain access to an organization that's been tracking my movements for over a week? By giving them what they want, Kellerman said, and something in his tone made Sarah understand that the next part of the conversation would fundamentally change her relationship with this mission. 3 days ago, we intercepted communications indicating that Kozlov's organization has been expecting contact from American intelligence. They've been preparing for some kind of negotiation or exchange. They want something from us, Lieutenant. Something important enough that they've been keeping Chun and Torres alive as leverage. Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, but the picture they formed was more complex and more dangerous than anything she'd been briefed to expect. What do they want? Information about joint NATO operations in the region, troop movements, supply lines, intelligence assessments about their activities. The kind of strategic intelligence that would allow them to expand their operations without interference from Western military forces. The weight of what Kellerman was suggesting settled on Sarah like a physical burden. You want me to pose as a corrupt intelligence officer willing to trade classified information for the release of our personnel. I want you to become whatever you need to become to get our people out, Kellerman corrected. The intelligence we're prepared to provide is carefully controlled, real enough to establish credibility, but limited enough to prevent actual damage to operational security. Sarah understood the logic, but she also understood the risks that extended far beyond her personal survival. Sir, if I'm captured during this kind of operation, if they determine that the intelligence is limited or controlled, they'll assume I'm part of a larger deception operation. That won't just compromise my mission, it'll put Chun and Torres at increased risk. And if we don't attempt this approach, Chun and Torres are dead within 72 hours anyway, Kellerman replied, with brutal honesty. This is the only chance we have to get them out alive. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process the enormity of what was being asked of her. The mission had evolved from reconnaissance to community engagement, to infiltration, to what amounted to a solo rescue operation against a sophisticated criminal organization with military-grade capabilities. How do I make contact with Kozlov's people in a way that suggests I'm offering cooperation rather than conducting surveillance? That's where your previous contacts become an asset rather than a liability, Kellerman explained. The fact that they've been tracking you, that they know you're American military, that they've had multiple opportunities to eliminate you, but haven't, that suggests they've been waiting for you to make exactly this kind of approach. The communication device in Sarah's hand suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of the conversation was somehow transferring through the encrypted connection. You're saying they've been expecting me to switch sides. I'm saying they've been expecting someone to offer them a deal. Your presence in the region, your failed attempts to build local support, your obvious isolation from effective backup from their perspective. You're exactly the kind of asset they could exploit. Sarah looked out through the cabin's single window at the mountain landscape that had become both her refuge and her prison over the past 10 days. Somewhere in that terrain, 2 American soldiers were being held by people who viewed them as commodities to be traded. Somewhere in those mountains was a criminal organization sophisticated enough to track her movements, disciplined enough to avoid killing her when they had the chance, and confident enough to wait for her to come to them. Sir, if I do this, if I approach them as a potential turncoat, there's no extraction plan that doesn't involve me completing the entire operation successfully. If anything goes wrong, if they suspect deception, if the intelligence doesn't satisfy them, I'm not just compromised, I'm dead. I understand the risks, Lieutenant. I also understand that you're the only person currently in position to attempt this approach, and that Chun and Torres are running out of time. Sarah felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every impossible situation of her military career, mixed with the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the next phase of her mission would be. I'll need the intelligence package immediately. Real enough to pass initial scrutiny, but not so comprehensive that they can verify everything before the exchange is complete. Already prepared and uploaded to your secure communication device. The package includes troop movement schedules, supply convoy routes, and assessment reports about regional criminal activities. All of it accurate but carefully dated to limit long-term value. Sarah accessed the files Kellerman was describing, scanning through intelligence reports that looked authentic enough to convince her, let alone criminal organizations with limited ability to verify classified military information. How do I arrange the initial contact? The same way you've been operating for the past week, Kellerman said, and Sarah could hear something like admiration in his voice. You walk up to them and start a conversation. Your previous approach wasn't failing because you lacked the right tactics, Lieutenant. It was failing because you were trying to accomplish the wrong objective. The realization that her entire mission had been misdirected hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Every failed contact, every blown cover, every indication that her approach was fundamentally wrong. It had all been preparing her for this moment, when she would need to approach Kozlov's organization not as an enemy, but as a potential ally. Sir, this is either the most brilliant operational planning I've ever encountered, or you've been making it up as you go along and hoping I'd be able to adapt when the situation demanded it. Kellerman's laugh carried across the encrypted connection, with surprising warmth. Lieutenant, the best special operations are the ones that look like brilliant planning but actually represent brilliant adaptation. You've been adapting to this mission since the moment you inserted it. Now you're just adapting in a direction that might actually work. Sarah stood up and began gathering her equipment, her mind already shifting into the focused state that preceded. High-risk operations. The abandoned cabin that had provided shelter for the night was about to become the launching point for an infiltration that would either rescue two American soldiers or result in her disappearance into a criminal network that had already demonstrated its sophistication and ruthlessness. I'm moving to establish contact within the next 6 hours, she said, checking her weapon and communications equipment with automatic precision. If this approach fails, if I'm compromised or captured, Chun and Torres become your primary responsibility. Understood. Lieutenant? Yes, sir? The psychological evaluation that labeled you unsuitable for special operations described someone who sees enemies as human beings rather than targets. For this mission, that's not a weakness. It's exactly what's going to keep you alive long enough to bring our people home. Sarah ended the communication and stepped out of the cabin into the cold mountain air, carrying with her the knowledge that the next few hours would determine whether her approach to special operations was vindicated, or whether it would result in the deaths of 3 American soldiers in a remote mountain facility that officially didn't exist, for the first time since the mission began. She felt like she was finally playing to her strengths rather than fighting against them. The approach Sarah chose would have horrified her instructors at every level of special operations training she'd ever received. Instead of careful reconnaissance, detailed planning, and coordinated insertion, She walked directly down the main road leading to the village of Sangiers, carrying a white cloth tied to a hiking pole and moving with the deliberate visibility of someone who wanted to be found. The October sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor as she made herself the most obvious target possible for anyone conducting surveillance in the area. She discarded every piece of equipment that identified her as military, except for her communications device and sidearm, replacing her tactical gear with civilian hiking clothes that looked appropriately worn and weather-beaten. The intelligence package was encrypted on a commercial tablet computer that could pass for tourist photography equipment. Her cover story was simple enough to be believable and complex enough to be checked. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, freelance intelligence analyst, seeking a business arrangement that would benefit both sides. The first contact came exactly as she'd hoped, not through careful negotiation or diplomatic channels, but through the direct intervention of people who'd been watching her approach for the past hour. 3 men emerged from concealment positions that Sarah had deliberately allowed herself to walk past, moving with the professional competence of people who'd done this before. Their leader was the same operative who'd confronted her a week earlier, but his demeanor had shifted from casual threat to businesslike interest. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, using the name she'd provided through carefully planted intelligence over the past 2 days, "we understand you have a proposition for our organization." Sarah stopped walking and lowered the improvised flag of truce, keeping her hands visible but maintaining the confident posture of someone who is conducting business, rather than surrendering. "I have information that I believe would be valuable to Mr. Kozlov, information that could prevent significant interference with his operations in this region." "What kind of information?" "The kind that comes from sources your organization doesn't have access to," Sarah replied, allowing a hint of professional pride to enter her voice. "NATO operational planning, American troop deployment schedules, intelligence assessments about regional criminal activities. The kind of strategic picture that allows forward-thinking organizations to expand their activities while avoiding unwanted attention." The operative studied her for a long moment, clearly evaluating whether she represented a genuine opportunity or an elaborate deception. Sarah used the silence to project the mix of confidence and desperation that characterized intelligence professionals who decided to monetize their access for personal gain. Why would an American intelligence analyst offer this kind of cooperation? Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that her motivation would be scrutinized more carefully than her credentials. Because American intelligence doesn't compensate analysts according to the value of the information they provide. Because I've spent 15 years building expertise that my government treats as a commodity. And because Mr. Kozlov's organization has resources that could ensure my expertise is properly valued. The explanation was cynical enough to be believable and specific enough to suggest genuine grievance rather than fabricated cover story. Sarah had studied the psychology of intelligence defectors extensively during her training, understanding that the most convincing traitors were those who felt genuinely undervalued by their original organizations. Mr. Kozlov doesn't meet with every analyst who claims to have valuable information, the operative said, but his tone suggested that Sarah had passed the initial credibility assessment. "Not every analyst," Sarah replied, producing the tablet computer and displaying the first page of her intelligence package. "I'm the analyst who knows that NATO is planning a joint operation in this region within the next month. I'm the analyst who has access to the operational planning that would allow your organization to avoid areas of increased military activity." The operative glanced at the displayed information, his expression shifting slightly as he recognized the authenticity of the document formatting and classification markings. Sarah had gambled that Kozlov's people would have enough experience with Western intelligence products to distinguish genuine materials from fabrications, but not enough technical capability to verify the specific operational details before committing to an exchange. "Follow us," the operative said after a moment of consideration. Mr. Kozlov will decide whether your information justifies the meeting you're requesting. The journey to Kozlov's compound took 3 hours through mountain terrain that would have been impassable without local knowledge. Sarah found herself in the back of a military-style vehicle, blindfolded but not restrained, traveling over roads that seemed designed to confuse rather than provide efficient transportation. The route included multiple stops where she could hear conversations in languages she didn't recognize, security protocols that suggested significant organizational sophistication. When the blindfold was finally removed, Sarah found herself in a courtyard surrounded by buildings that clearly predated the communist era but had been extensively modified with modern security features. The compound was larger than she'd expected, suggesting that Kozlov's operation was more extensive and more permanent than intelligence assessments had indicated. Victor Kozlov himself was not what Sarah had anticipated. Instead of the stereotypical criminal leader, he looked more like a successful businessman who happened to conduct his affairs in a remote mountain compound. Well-dressed, articulate, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd built an organization through strategic thinking rather than simple violence. "Dr. Mitchell," he said in English carrying only a slight accent, "I understand you believe we have mutual interests to discuss." The meeting took place in what appeared to be a conference room equipped with sophisticated communications equipment and detailed maps covering the entire regional area. Sarah noted the presence of military-grade planning materials, encrypted communication devices, and organizational charts that suggested Kozlov's network extended far beyond the local trafficking operation she'd been briefed to expect. "Mr. Kozlov, I have access to intelligence that could prevent significant disruption to your operations," Sarah began, projecting the professional confidence of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials. "I also understand that you currently possess assets that the American government would like to recover." Kozlov's expression didn't change, but Sarah noted the subtle shift in attention from the other personnel in the room. "What kind of assets?" "2 military personnel who were conducting unauthorized reconnaissance in your area of operations. Personnel whose continued detention creates problems for both of us. Ongoing search operations that increase military presence in the region. Intelligence investigations that could expose your organizational structure. Political pressure that could result in more aggressive intervention." Sarah was walking a careful line between acknowledging the hostages and admitting that their capture had been successful. She needed Kozlov to understand that she knew about Chun and Torres without revealing the extent of American intelligence about his operations. "And you propose what kind of exchange?" Sarah activated her tablet computer and displayed a carefully curated selection of intelligence reports, operational planning documents, and assessment summaries that would provide Kozlov with strategic advantages while limiting actual damage to American interests. "Complete NATO operational planning for this region over the next 6 months. Troop movement schedules that would allow you to avoid areas of increased military activity. Intelligence assessments about regional criminal organizations that could help you identify potential competitors or collaborators. Communication intercepts that would give you advance warning about law enforcement operations." Kozlov studied the displayed information with the focused attention of someone who understood its potential value. Sarah watched him process the implications, calculating how such intelligence could be used to expand his operations while minimizing risk from government interference. "This information would need to be verified," he said after several minutes of review. "The documents include verification codes that can be authenticated through standard intelligence channels," Sarah replied, displaying technical details that she knew would be difficult to check quickly. "But the value isn't just in the specific information, it's in having a reliable source for ongoing intelligence updates." The suggestion that this could be the beginning of a longer relationship rather than a single exchange was calculated to increase her value while providing cover for the rescue operation she was actually planning. What guarantees do we have that this isn't an elaborate deception operation? Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would address Kozlov's concerns while advancing her actual mission. The same guarantee you have about any business relationship, mutual benefit, and ongoing cooperation. I provide intelligence that helps your organization avoid problems. You provide compensation that makes the arrangement worthwhile for both sides. She paused, allowing the business proposition to settle before introducing the rescue element. The detention of American military personnel creates unnecessary complications for both of us. Releasing them demonstrates good faith while eliminating a source of ongoing attention from American intelligence services. Kozlov was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the potential benefits against the risks of trusting an American intelligence analyst who'd appeared out of nowhere with an offer that seemed too convenient to be genuine. The personnel you're referring to would be released as part of any arrangement we conclude, he said finally. But the value of such a gesture would need to be reflected in the compensation we receive. Sarah felt a surge of carefully controlled excitement. Kozlov had just confirmed that Chun and Torres were alive and had opened negotiations about their release. But she also understood that the next phase of the operation would be the most dangerous, actually conducting the exchange in a way that allowed her to escape with the hostages. I'm prepared to provide the complete intelligence package immediately, she said, making a decision that violated every protocol about maintaining leverage during negotiations. The strategic value of the information diminishes with time, and demonstrating good faith now establishes the foundation for future cooperation. The offer to provide the intelligence before receiving the hostages was a calculated risk, designed to project confidence and commitment while creating opportunities for her to gather information about the compound's layout and security procedures. Kozlov's expression suggested he was both impressed and suspicious about her willingness to transfer valuable intelligence without receiving immediate compensation. You're very trustworthy for an intelligence professional. I'm very confident in the value of what I'm providing, Sarah corrected. And I understand that successful business relationships require someone to demonstrate good faith first. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah provided detailed briefings about the intelligence package while conducting subtle reconnaissance of the compound security arrangements, personnel patterns, and physical layout. She noted guard rotations, communication procedures, and most importantly, the location of a building that seemed to receive more security attention than the others. The facility where Chun and Torres were being held was a converted storage building, approximately 200 meters from the main compound, guarded by rotating teams of 2 operatives and equipped with electronic surveillance that would make conventional rescue approaches extremely difficult. But Sarah wasn't planning a conventional rescue approach. She was planning something that would either demonstrate the validity of her unconventional special operations philosophy or get all 3 of them killed in the attempt. As the evening progressed and Kozlov's organization processed the intelligence she'd provided, Sarah began implementing a plan that relied on everything her psychological evaluation had identified as weaknesses: empathy, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to see enemies as human beings rather than targets. The plan that would either save 3 American lives or prove that sometimes being too soft was exactly the right approach to an impossible situation. The rescue went wrong in ways that no training manual could have prepared Sarah for. It began exactly as planned. At 0230 hours, during the guard rotation she'd observed 3 times over the past 18 hours, Sarah used the compound's own security protocols against them. The intelligence package she'd provided had included detailed information about American surveillance capabilities, which gave her the perfect excuse to conduct a security assessment of the facility where Chun and Torres were being held. Mr. Kozlov, she'd said during their evening meeting, if this partnership is going to be sustainable, we need to address potential vulnerabilities in your operational security. The facility you're using for high-value detainees is visible from satellite imagery that American intelligence reviews daily. Kozlov had granted her access to inspect the building, accompanied by 2 guards who viewed her as a business consultant, rather than a rescue operative. Sarah's psychological profile, her ability to be seen as helpful rather than threatening, had opened doors that explosive charges and tactical teams never could have breached. The inspection revealed everything she needed to know. Chun and Torres were being held in separate rooms within the converted storage building, both injured but mobile, both alert enough to recognize rescue when it arrived. The building's security was designed to prevent escape attempts, not to resist. Internal threats from trusted personnel. Sarah had spent 15 minutes explaining to the guards how American satellite surveillance worked, demonstrating the compound's vulnerabilities on her tablet computer, while systematically disabling the electronic monitoring systems that protected the detention facility. Her technical expertise, combined with her apparent loyalty to Kozlov's organization, had convinced the guards to help her implement security improvements that actually eliminated their ability to observe what happened inside the building. Actual rescue took 7 minutes. Sarah used lockpicking skills she'd learned during unconventional warfare training to access Chien and Torres's rooms, provided them with weapons from the compound's own armory, and led them through an evacuation route she'd mapped during her security assessment. The 3 of them were outside the perimeter and moving toward the extraction point before anyone realized what had happened. That was when everything went catastrophically wrong. The helicopter that was supposed to extract them from a clearing 2 kilometers from the compound never arrived. Instead, Sarah's communications device crackled with Colonel Kellerman's voice delivering the kind of news that ended careers and sometimes lives. Archer 7, extract is compromised. The Romanian military detected unauthorized aircraft crossing their airspace. Your extraction bird was forced to abort to avoid an international incident. Sarah pressed herself against a tree trunk and tried to process what Kellerman was telling her while Chun and Torres took defensive positions in the forest around her. They were 3 American soldiers, alone in hostile territory, surrounded by a criminal organization that now knew they'd been deceived, with no immediate means of reaching friendly forces. Sir, we need immediate alternative extraction. We have the packages, but our window is closing rapidly. Negative on immediate extraction. The Romanian government is conducting air patrols throughout the region. Any American aircraft attempting insertion would be detected and intercepted. You're going to have to reach the border on foot. Sarah looked at her topographical maps and felt her stomach drop. The Romanian border was 60 kilometers away through mountain terrain that would challenge healthy, well-equipped soldiers under ideal conditions. Chun was moving with a pronounced limp from injury sustained during his capture. Torres had been beaten badly enough that his left arm was essentially useless. The October weather was deteriorating toward what forecasters predicted would be an early winter storm system. Sir, the packages are not in condition for extended overland movement. We need alternative extraction options. There are no alternative extraction options, Kellerman replied, his voice carrying the finality of someone who'd exhausted every possibility. Romanian authorities are treating the border region as a potential international incident. American military assets cannot operate in that airspace without risking diplomatic consequences that extend far beyond this operation. Behind them, Sarah could hear the distant sound of vehicles starting up at Kozlov's compound, the beginning of a pursuit that would be conducted by people who knew the terrain better than she did, who had superior numbers and equipment, and who now had every reason to kill rather than capture American operatives. Move, Sarah told Chun and Torres, though she knew the order was essentially pointless. They couldn't move fast enough to outrun vehicles. They couldn't hide effectively enough to avoid detection by local populations that were either controlled by or sympathetic to Kozlov's organization. They couldn't fight effectively enough to defeat the pursuit force. That would inevitably catch up with them, but they moved anyway, because movement was the only option that offered any possibility of survival. The next 18 hours were a nightmare of endurance that tested every survival skill Sarah had ever learned. They moved through terrain that shifted from dense forest to open meadows to rocky slopes that offered no concealment from aerial observation. Chun's injuries forced them to stop every few hours for rest he couldn't afford and medical attention Sarah couldn't provide with their limited supplies. Torres compensated for his damaged arm by carrying more than his share of equipment, but his determination couldn't overcome the physical limitations imposed by his injuries. The pursuit was relentless and sophisticated. Kozlov's people used vehicles where the terrain allowed, aircraft for reconnaissance, and local knowledge that gave them advantages no amount of American training could overcome. They herded Sarah's team like wolves pursuing wounded prey, cutting off routes toward the border and forcing them deeper into mountain terrain where survival became more important than escape. On the second day, Torres collapsed. The combination of his injuries, inadequate medical treatment, and the physical demands of moving through hostile terrain had pushed his body beyond its limits. He fell during a stream crossing and couldn't get back up, his system shutting down in the way that indicated serious internal injuries rather than simple exhaustion. "Leave me," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood that his survival was now incompatible with the team's mission. "Take Chun and keep moving. I'll delay the pursuit as long as I can." Sarah looked at Torres, a professional soldier who'd served his country with distinction, who'd been captured while conducting a mission to protect civilian populations, who was now offering to sacrifice his life so that his teammate might have a chance to escape, and made a decision that would haunt every day of the ordeal that followed. "We don't leave on our own," she said, using words that had become meaningless in the context of their current situation. "We find another way." But there was no other way. The terrain ahead was impassable for someone in Torres's condition. The pursuit behind them was closing rapidly enough that stopping to treat his injuries would result in capture or death for all three of them. The extraction options that Kellerman had promised were political impossibilities that wouldn't materialize, regardless of how long they waited. Sarah spent the next 6 hours trying to find solutions that didn't exist, carrying Torres when he couldn't walk, treating injuries with medical supplies that were inadequate for his condition, moving through terrain that offered no sanctuary from the elements or their pursuers. She was trying to save everyone, and her refusal to accept that some situations had no good solutions was about to get all three of them killed. Chun made the decision for her. "Sarah," he said during what she'd planned as a brief rest stop, "Sergeant, Torres is dying. We can't save him by carrying him through mountains that are going to kill all of us. We can honor him by making sure his sacrifice means something." Torres was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his body temperature dropping in ways that indicated systemic failure rather than hypothermia. Sarah had seen enough battlefield casualties to recognize that Chin was right. Torres was dying, and her attempts to save him were ensuring that his death would accomplish nothing. "I can't leave him," Sarah said, though she knew the words were emotional rather than tactical. "You're not leaving him," Chun replied with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that leadership sometimes required accepting unacceptable losses. "You're making sure that American soldiers come home alive. Torres would understand that. Torres would order you to do exactly what I'm asking you to do." Sarah looked at Torres, then at Chun, then at the mountain terrain that stretched toward a border she wasn't sure they could reach even under ideal conditions. The psychological evaluation that had labeled her as too soft for special operations had been right about one thing she did struggle with making: decisions that required accepting casualties for the greater good. But that same evaluation had missed something important: her inability to view soldiers as expendable assets, was exactly what had kept her fighting to save Torres long after conventional military logic would have required abandoning him. Her refusal to accept necessary losses was what had motivated every creative solution, every impossible effort, every attempt to find alternatives that might save everyone. Those same qualities would be what kept her alive during the 30 days that followed, when survival would depend on her ability to see every challenge as a problem to be solved, rather than a fate to be accepted. Her empathy, her cultural sensitivity, her refusal to dehumanize enemies or accept the inevitability of loss, all the characteristics that made her supposedly unsuitable for special operations, would become the tools that allowed her to survive in conditions that would have killed operators who relied exclusively on conventional training. But first, she had to make the hardest decision of her military career. Sarah knelt beside Torres and checked his vital signs one final time. His pulse was barely detectable, his breathing had become sporadic, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that indicated multiple organ failure. Medical intervention might have saved him in a fully equipped hospital, but in the mountains of Romania with limited supplies and no extraction options, he was beyond help. "Torres," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure he could hear her, "we're going to get Chun home. We're going to make sure this mission means something. And we're going to remember that you made it possible." She stood up and looked at Chun, who was watching her with the respect that one professional gives another when witnessing the kind of decision that defines a leader's character. "We move in 10 minutes, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the weight of what they were leaving behind. "We reach the border in 5 days, and we bring home intelligence about Kozlov's organization that saves other soldiers from going through what we've been through." Chun nodded once, understanding that Sarah had just transformed from rescue operative to survival leader, that the mission had evolved from extraction to endurance, and that the next phase of their ordeal would test every assumption anyone had ever made about her suitability for special operations. They left Torres in a sheltered position with enough supplies to keep him comfortable during his final hours, marked the location for eventual recovery, and began moving toward a border that seemed impossibly distant through terrain that would challenge every survival skill they possessed. Behind them, the pursuit continued. Ahead of them, the mountains waited with the patient indifference of forces that had killed stronger soldiers than Sarah Mitchell. But Sarah carried with her something that conventional special operations training couldn't provide, and psychological evaluations couldn't measure: the absolute conviction that empathy and determination were not weaknesses to be overcome, but strengths to be employed, and that sometimes the softest heart produced the strongest will to survive against impossible odds. 30 days. That's how long Sarah Mitchell and Captain Rebecca Chun survived in the Carpathian Mountains with nothing but their training, their determination, and Sarah's supposedly soft approach to impossible situations. 30 days of temperatures that dropped below freezing every night, terrain that challenged Olympic athletes, and pursuit by an organization that have every resource advantage except one. They didn't understand how someone, labeled as too empathetic, could become the most dangerous kind of survivor. The first week was about staying ahead of Kozlov's search teams. Sarah used everything the psychological evaluations had criticized about her approach: her tendency to see patterns in human behavior, her instinct to understand rather than simply overcome opposition, her ability to anticipate how communities would respond to external pressure. While conventional military thinking would have focused on speed and concealment, Sarah recognized that their survival depended on understanding the human geography of the region as much as its physical terrain. She identified villages where the local population would be sympathetic to refugees, communities where Kozlov's influence was minimal, families who had their own reasons to distrust the trafficking organization. Instead of avoiding all human contact, she carefully selected interactions that provided intelligence, supplies, and temporary shelter while minimizing exposure to hostile elements. "How did you know they would help us?" Chun asked after their Third, successful contact with local civilians who provided food and medical supplies without asking dangerous questions. Sarah was treating the infected. Cut on Chun's arm with antibiotics obtained from a village doctor who'd lost his own daughter. To trafficking operations. Because I listened to what people were actually saying instead of what I expected them to say. Because I paid attention to their fears rather than assuming they were all potential enemies. The second week was about adaptation. The pursuing forces had changed their tactics, using local knowledge to predict movement patterns and establish checkpoints that would catch conventional evaders. But Sarah's approach wasn't conventional. It was based on understanding community dynamics, seasonal migration patterns, and cultural practices that outsiders wouldn't recognize as tactical opportunities. She guided Chun through a region where traditional shepherds moved their flocks during autumn transitions, timing their movement to coincide with activities that provided natural camouflage. She identified religious observances that would concentrate local populations in predictable locations, creating opportunities for movement through temporarily empty areas. She recognized economic patterns that would cause temporary disruptions. In Kozlov's surveillance network, as his personnel dealt with other priorities. "You're not just surviving," Chun observed during a rest stop in an abandoned monastery that Sarah had identified as a safe waypoint. "You're thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone who's trying to catch us." Sarah checked her map and calculated their remaining distance to the border. "I'm thinking like someone who understands that people are predictable if you pay attention to what motivates them. Kozlov's people are effective because they understand local fears and dependencies, but they're also limited by the same assumptions that make them effective." The third week was about endurance. The early winter storm that weather forecasters had predicted arrived with devastating intensity, bringing snowfall that eliminated their ability to move during daylight hours and temperatures that would kill anyone without proper shelter and equipment. Chun's injuries, inadequately treated during their escape, began to worsen under the stress of extreme conditions. This was when Sarah's psychological profile became a survival asset rather than an operational liability. Her tendency to see individual human needs rather than abstract tactical problems led her to solutions that conventional survival training wouldn't have considered. She identified an elderly farmer whose isolation made him both safe to approach and desperate for companionship during the harsh weather. Instead of requesting temporary shelter, she offered to help with winter preparations that were beyond his physical capabilities. For 6 days while the storm raged outside, Sarah and Chun helped repair buildings, process food stores, and maintain livestock in exchange for shelter, medical supplies, and detailed local knowledge about safe passage routes. "Why are you helping us?" Chun asked the farmer during their final evening in his homestead. The old man looked at Sarah, who was teaching his granddaughter basic first aid techniques with supplies from her medical kit. "Because she sees that helping you helps all of us. Because she understands that surviving winter requires community, not just individual strength." The fourth week was about sacrifice and determination. Chun's condition deteriorated to the point where movement became extremely difficult. But Sarah refused to abandon. Her teammate, despite tactical logic that suggested individual survival was more achievable than joint extraction. Her psychological evaluation had been right about her inability to accept necessary losses, but wrong about whether that characteristic was a weakness. Sarah's refusal to abandon. Chun forced her to find creative solutions that wouldn't have occurred. To operators trained to prioritize mission success over individual casualties. She negotiated with a network of local families to establish a communication system that allowed them to move between safe houses without exposing their helpers to retaliation. She traded medical expertise for transportation, using her first aid skills to treat community health problems in exchange for resources and assistance. Most importantly, she recognized that their survival wasn't just about reaching the Romanian border, It was about reaching it in a way that protected the people who'd helped them and provided intelligence that would prevent other American soldiers from facing similar ordeals. The final breakthrough came when Sarah realized that Kozlov's organization wasn't just hunting them. It was hunting them in ways that exposed the network's operational structure, communication patterns, and resource allocation methods. Every search operation revealed information about how the trafficking network functioned, where its vulnerabilities existed, and which local populations were coerced rather than willing participants. "We're not just surviving," Sarah told Chun, as they prepared for the final push toward the border. "We're gathering intelligence that's going to shut down this entire operation." Sarah had been documenting everything: which villages were controlled through economic dependency versus intimidation, how the organization moved personnel and resources through the region, where communication networks were vulnerable to disruption, which local leaders could be potential allies in future operations against trafficking networks. The border crossing itself was almost anticlimactic. Sarah used her understanding of bureaucratic psychology to approach Romanian border guards, not as escaping refugees, but as American intelligence personnel conducting authorized operations who needed immediate contact with embassy officials. Her confidence, combined with documentation she'd prepared during their month-long journey, convinced border security to treat them as legitimate government representatives rather than illegal immigrants. Within 6 hours, they were in American custody. Within 12 hours, Sarah was debriefing intelligence officials about an operation that had transformed from a simple rescue mission into one of the most comprehensive intelligence-gathering efforts ever conducted against Eastern European trafficking networks. Colonel Kellerman met them at the embassy medical facility, where Chun was receiving treatment for injuries that would have been fatal without Sarah's improvised medical care during their mountain ordeal. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying respect that hadn't been present during their initial meeting. "Your after-action report is going to revolutionize how we think about special operations in complex environments." Sarah was exhausted, in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, carrying the weight of Torres's death and the knowledge that 30 days of survival had been purchased with sacrifices that conventional metrics couldn't measure. "Sir, Sergeant Torres died because I wasn't able to find a solution that saved everyone. The mission succeeded, but the cost was too high." Kellerman sat down beside her hospital bed, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Lieutenant, Torres died because he was captured during a mission to combat human trafficking. You and Chun survived because you found ways to turn impossible odds into manageable challenges. The intelligence you gathered is going to save hundreds of lives and shut down networks that have operated with impunity for years." He pulled out a tablet computer displaying satellite imagery, surveillance reports, and operational assessments. "Your documentation of local community dynamics, organizational structures, and operational vulnerabilities has given us the most comprehensive picture of regional trafficking networks that intelligence services have ever possessed. The psychological approach that your evaluation criticized as a weakness has produced intelligence results that conventional operations couldn't achieve." Sarah looked at the materials Kellerman was showing her, recognizing her own observations and analysis, but seeing them now in the context of a broader intelligence picture. Her month of survival had inadvertently become a month of deep cover intelligence gathering. Her empathetic approach to local populations had provided insights that traditional spycraft couldn't access. What happens now? Now you get to prove that everything your critics said about special operations psychology was wrong. Kellerman replied with something that might have been satisfaction. "The Joint Chiefs want to establish a new operational protocol based on your approach. Cultural integration operations that use empathy and community engagement as tactical tools rather than obstacles to overcome." 6 months later, Sarah found herself back in the Pentagon, but this time as the architect of training programs rather than the subject of psychological evaluations. The conference room was filled with special operations commanders, intelligence officials, and policymakers who were trying to understand how someone labeled as too soft had achieved results that conventional approaches couldn't match. The fundamental assumption we need to challenge, Sarah said, addressing an audience that included some of the same generals who'd questioned her fitness for special operations, is that emotional intelligence and tactical effectiveness are mutually exclusive. The psychological characteristics that make someone good at understanding human motivation, cultural dynamics, and community relationships are the same characteristics that make them effective at operations in complex environments. General Webb, who'd been part of Sarah's original evaluation board, raised her hand. "Lieutenant, excuse me, Captain Mitchell, are you suggesting that traditional special operations training is inadequate?" Sarah had been promoted twice in the months following her Romanian operation, recognition for achievements that couldn't be measured by conventional military metrics but represented fundamental advances in operational capability. "I'm suggesting that traditional special operations training is incomplete," Sarah replied. "We train people to overcome opposition through superior skill and equipment, but we don't train them to prevent opposition by understanding why it exists and addressing the underlying causes." She displayed a map of the Carpathian region, now marked with symbols indicating trafficking networks that had been disrupted, communities that had been liberated, and operational routes that had been closed based on intelligence gathered during her 30-day survival ordeal. The trafficking network that captured Chun and Torres was dismantled not through military force, but through community engagement that gave local populations the tools and confidence to resist coercion. The psychological approach that was labeled as a weakness became the foundation for operations that conventional special forces couldn't have accomplished. General Harrison, the most skeptical member of the original evaluation board, leaned forward with an expression that suggested genuine curiosity rather than dismissal. "Captain, are you saying that empathy is a tactical weapon?" Sarah thought about Torres, about the communities that had risked their safety to help American soldiers, about the month in the mountains when survival had depended on understanding human nature rather than overcoming it. "I'm saying that empathy is intelligence, sir. The ability to understand how people think, what motivates them, what they fear, and what they value. That's not a weakness that compromises tactical effectiveness. It's a capability that enables tactical effectiveness in environments where traditional approaches fail." She paused, looking around the room, faces that represented the highest levels of American military leadership, people who would determine whether her approach became an anomaly or a new standard for special operations. "The psychological evaluation that labeled me as too soft for special operations was right. About one thing, I do see enemies as human beings rather than just targets. But what the evaluation missed is that understanding your enemies as human beings doesn't make you less effective at defeating them. It makes you better at finding solutions that don't require defeating them at all." The room was quiet for a long moment, filled with the weight of implications that extended far beyond one officer's career or one successful operation. "Sometimes," Sarah continued, "the strongest thing you can do is refuse to become something you're not, even when everyone around you insists that's what strength looks like. Sometimes the best way to prove you're tough enough for the mission is to show that the mission doesn't require you to be tough in the ways people expect." 6 months after that briefing, the U.S. military established the Community Integration Operations Program, training special operations personnel in cultural psychology, community engagement, and conflict resolution techniques that complemented rather than replaced traditional tactical skills. Sarah Mitchell became the program's first director, responsible for training operators who could build bridges instead of just burning them, who could solve problems through understanding instead of just overwhelming them, who could succeed in complex environments by seeing the humanity in everyone they encountered. The psychological evaluation that had nearly ended Her career was quietly removed from her permanent file, replaced by assessments that recognized empathy, cultural sensitivity, and emotional intelligence as essential qualifications for modern special operations, rather than disqualifying weaknesses. But Sarah kept a copy of the original evaluation in her office, not as a reminder of institutional failure, but as evidence of something more important. Sometimes the characteristics that make you different are exactly the characteristics that make you essential. Sometimes being too soft for special operations is exactly what special operations needs to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.